November 17, 1950, Philadelphia, Conservation Studio of the Pennsylvania Historical Society. Warren Haskell drew his scalpel across the canvas surface and froze. Beneath the top layer of paint depicting a distinguished industrialist in a double-breasted suit with an American flag pin on his lapel, another face was emerging. The same face. The same eyes, same set of the mouth, same mole near the left temple. But the clothing was different, completely different. Warren had spent 15 years restoring American portraiture and had never seen such attire in the Society's galleries. He carefully removed another microscopic layer of oil paint. In the lower right corner, an inscription appeared. A date, 1942. The conservator's heart pounded so loudly he could hear his own pulse in the empty studio's silence. He knew that some things were better left undiscovered. But the scalpel was already moving forward, stripping away layer after layer of American lies. Warren Haskell was born in 1914 in Scranton, Pennsylvania, to a high school mathematics teacher and a seamstress. The Depression hit when he was 15, leaving scars deeper than the war that followed. His father lost his teaching position in 1930 and never fully recovered his spirit. Warren remembered those years as gray and hungry, but also strangely focused. While other boys his age scrambled for work at the mines or mills, Warren spent hours in the public library, copying plates from art books. His mother noticed how the boy could lose himself for an entire afternoon reproducing a Sargent portrait or a Whistler landscape from a grainy black and white illustration. She saw in him something she'd never possessed herself, something that transcended their cramped apartment with its peeling wallpaper and the constant smell of cabbage soup. A gift. A way out. In 1932, during the worst of it, when her husband sat motionless by the window watching the unemployed men queue at the soup kitchen, she used her savings to buy Warren a set of brushes and a book on old master techniques. $23. More than a week's grocery money. It was an extravagance they couldn't afford. It was also the best investment she ever made. In 1933, Warren won a scholarship to the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. His mother cried when the letter arrived, holding it against her chest like a holy relic. His father shook his hand formally, gravely, as if confirming something he'd always suspected but never dared hope for. Warren studied under the old guard, men who'd trained in Paris before the First War, who spoke of Rembrandt and Velázquez as if they were personal acquaintances. Professor Edmund Tarbell, nearly 70 by then, took a particular interest in Warren. The boy had good hands, Tarbell noted. Steady, patient. Not the flamboyant virtuosity of a painter, but the meticulous precision of a surgeon. You won't be famous, Tarbell told him during their final year. You won't have your own exhibitions or make society portraits. But you'll do something more important. You'll preserve what others create. You'll be the guardian of truth. Warren graduated in 1937 with honors and immediately found work at the Historical Society as a junior conservator. The work was invisible, unglamorous, essential. Nobody notices the restorer. Everyone looks at the painting, but nobody thinks about who brought it back to life. Warren loved this invisibility. It allowed him to be honest. Every brushstroke had to match the artist's original intent, even when that intent was a lie. His mentor at the Society was Dr. Victor Eisenstadt, a German Jewish émigré who'd fled Munich in 1936 when he saw which way the wind was blowing. Eisenstadt was 62, white-haired, with hands that trembled slightly from Parkinson's, but eyes that could still spot a fake canvas from across the room. He taught Warren that restoration was archaeology. You don't just repair damage, you investigate. You ask questions. Every crack, every discoloration, every alteration tells a story. Sometimes that story is innocent, the natural aging of materials. Sometimes it's deliberate. Someone trying to hide something, to change history. Your job, Eisenstadt would say, tapping his finger on Warren's workbench, is to uncover what was hidden, to restore not just the image, but the truth. Warren met Helen Morrison in 1939 at a society fundraiser. She was 22, pretty, with auburn hair and green eyes that suggested both intelligence and humor. Her father owned a printing business in West Philadelphia, solid middle class, respectable. They married in June 1940, a small ceremony at her parents' Episcopal church. Warren remembered the wedding as impossibly bright. Helen in white lace, sunshine streaming through stained glass, a future that seemed certain and good. They rented a small apartment on Spruce Street, 2 rooms and a kitchen, furnished with cast-offs from both families. Helen worked as a secretary at an insurance company. Warren walked to work each morning, carrying his lunch in a paper bag. They were building something together. A life. A partnership. When Margaret was born in 1943, Warren felt his chest expand with a joy he'd never known. He held his daughter in the hospital, this tiny, warm creature, and made silent promises. She would never know hunger, never know the gray desperation of the Depression. He would work hard, save money, provide security. He would be better than his own father, who'd given up when things got difficult. The portrait arrived at the studio 2 weeks ago. November 3, 1950, the Society's director, Dr. Edmund Ashworth, personally delivered the canvas wrapped in brown paper. Ashworth had replaced Eisenstadt after the old man's death in 1947. The new director was younger, smoother, more political, less interested in scholarship than in funding, less concerned with truth than with not offending donors. The director's face was serious, slightly tense. "This is the formal portrait of Mr. Harlan J. Pritchard," he said, president of Pritchard Steel Industries and member of the Commonwealth's War Production Board. The portrait had hung in the State House's Hall of Industry since 1946. Recently, they discovered damage, paint flaking in several places. It needed restoration, careful work, meticulous. By next Independence Day, the portrait needed to be back in its place. Ashworth paused, looked directly at Warren. "Mr. Pritchard is a significant benefactor of the Society. He's funded our new climate-controlled storage facility. His foundation underwrites our Conservation Department's operating budget. This restoration is important. Do you understand?" Warren nodded. Standard assignment. He unwrapped the canvas on his work table and switched on the adjustable lamp. The portrait was executed in the academic style typical of the mid-1940s. A man in his early 50s wearing a well-tailored suit, an American flag pin on his lapel, a distinguished bearing. His chest displayed no military medals, but there was a small ribbon bar, something Warren couldn't quite make out in detail. The face was strong, determined, but not cruel. A typical American industrial leader of the wartime era. The artist had worked professionally, competently, without particular flair. The signature in the lower right corner read, ___quote_0___. Warren knew Morrison slightly, a Philadelphia portraitist who did corporate commissions. Competent technique, no imagination. Warren ran his fingers across the canvas surface, studying the damage pattern. That's when he felt the strangeness. The paint lay too thick, much thicker than necessary for a standard portrait. In his 15 years at the Society, Warren had restored dozens of portraits from this period. He knew how thick the paint should be. This was different. Deliberately different. On the 4th day of work, Warren began cleaning a section near the subject's left shoulder. Here, the paint had flaked most severely, exposing the lower layer of gesso. When he carefully removed the loosened fragments, different paint appeared underneath. Older paint. Darkened by time, but clearly different in tone and texture. Warren frowned. This meant the portrait had been painted over another picture. The practice wasn't uncommon, especially during the war years when canvas was scarce due to rationing. Artists often painted new works over old, unwanted ones. But this portrait was dated 1946. There was no canvas shortage by then. Canvas suppliers had resumed full production in 1945. Why use an old base for a formal commission, especially one as important as a State House portrait? Warren took his scalpel and began carefully removing the upper paint layer on a small area the size of a quarter. The technique required surgical precision. Too deep and you damage the original. Too shallow and you can't see what's hidden below. He worked slowly, removing paint layer by layer, micron by micron. After 2 hours, on an area roughly 2 inches square, an image appeared. A fragment of insignia. But not American. Warren leaned closer, adjusting the magnifying lamp. The insignia was rendered in meticulous detail, dark against a lighter background. He recognized the style immediately. German military. Third Reich. Warren switched off the lamp, leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. The studio was quiet. Outside the window, dusk was gathering over the city. Philadelphia traffic hummed distantly. Somewhere a church bell chimed 5 times. Warren switched the lamp back on and looked at the canvas. The insignia was there, real, not a hallucination, not a trick of light or a stain that resembled something sinister. It was deliberate, painted with skill and care, part of a larger composition. Warren sat motionless for 10 minutes. His mind raced through explanations. A mistake. The artist had reused an old canvas from some historical painting. Maybe a study for a World War I memorial that depicted German soldiers. Perfectly innocent. But World War I German uniforms didn't have that style of insignia. Warren knew military iconography, had restored dozens of military portraits. This was Third Reich. Wartime. 1940s. He looked at the date on the upper portrait again. 1946. 1 year after the war ended. 1 year after the camps were liberated. After the newsreels showed the ovens and the mass graves and the skeletal survivors. After America understood what the swastika meant. After everyone knew. And someone had carefully painted an American flag over a German eagle. Warren's hands were shaking. He put down the scalpel, afraid he'd cut himself. That night at dinner, Helen noticed his distraction. "You barely touched your food," she said. "What's wrong?" "Nothing," Warren lied. "Just a challenging restoration. The canvas is in worse shape than I thought." "Will you make the deadline?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "I'll make it." Margaret, 7 years old, chattered about school. Her teacher had praised her drawing of a pumpkin. She wanted to be an artist like Daddy. Warren smiled, ruffled her hair, felt his heart contract with protective love. After Margaret went to bed, Helen sat beside him on the sofa. "You can tell me," she said quietly, "whatever's bothering you." Warren looked at his wife's concerned face, thought about telling her, decided against it. Not yet. Not until he knew more. "It's nothing," he repeated. "Just work." Helen studied him for a moment, then nodded. But her eyes said she knew he was lying. The next day, Warren arrived at the studio earlier than usual. 6 in the morning. Nobody else there yet. The night watchman, an elderly veteran named Frank who'd lost his left arm at Belleau Wood, looked at him with surprise, but let him through without questions. Mr. Haskell often worked unusual hours when concentration was required. Warren locked the studio door from inside, turned on all the lamps, and spread the canvas on his work table. Today, he would continue the cleaning. Methodically. Systematically. He told himself he was just doing his job. A conservator investigates. Eisenstadt had taught him that. You uncover what's hidden. You document everything. You serve the truth. He started with the chest area of the subject. Here, the upper paint layer was especially dense, as if the artist had tried particularly hard to conceal something important. Warren worked with the scalpel for 3 straight hours, stopping only to photograph each stage of the work. This was standard conservation practice. Every action had to be documented. The Society maintained meticulous archives of all restoration work. Photographs, notes, chemical analyses, everything. Future conservators might need to know what had been done. Warren set up his camera on a tripod, used a cable release to avoid vibration, took shots at each major stage. When he'd cleaned an area the size of his palm, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Under the American flag pin and the indistinct ribbon bar, different insignia was emerging. The eagle and swastika, the Hoheitsabzeichen of the Third Reich. Detailed, precise, painted with obvious knowledge of the correct specifications. And below it, collar tabs, rank insignia, officers' shoulder boards. Warren set down the scalpel and sat heavily in his chair. His hands were shaking. He poured himself water from the pitcher on his desk, drank it in one gulp, and looked at the canvas again. The insignia was there, clear, detailed, unmistakable. The man in the lower portrait wore the symbols of Nazi Germany. Warren picked up one of the photographs he'd just taken, held it next to the canvas. Same face. Absolutely the same. Same bone structure, same distinctive mole near the left temple, same shape of the ears. This wasn't a generic German officer painted on a random canvas that someone later reused. This was Harlan J. Pritchard, the same man, painted in German military dress. Warren understood he needed to stop, right now. Paint over the clean section, write in his report that the portrait required standard restoration methods, document only the surface work, and never think about this again. He understood this very clearly. 36 years of life had taught him that some questions were dangerous even to formulate in your own mind. Especially questions about rich, powerful men. Men who funded institutions. Men with lawyers and connections and the ability to destroy anyone who challenged them. But his hands kept holding the scalpel, kept removing layer after layer, kept uncovering the truth that someone had very carefully painted over with American colors 5 years ago. By noon, Warren had cleaned a section roughly 8 by 12 inches in the center of the portrait. Under the American business suit, German military dress was emerging, not SS. Warren's first terrified thought had been SS, which would have been even worse. But no, regular Wehrmacht. Field gray, with shoulder boards, collar tabs, and insignia. The uniform of the German army. The face was the same, absolutely the same. Same eyes, same nose, same mole near the left temple. Just 10-some years younger. The portrait underneath showed a man in his early 40s. The portrait on top showed the same man in his early 50s. Mathematics was simple. 1942 to 1946. 4 years. The face had aged appropriately. Warren took another dozen photographs, numbered them carefully in his logbook, and hid the film in his jacket pocket. He'd developed film at home before. Had his own darkroom set up in the basement of the apartment building, shared with 2 other photography enthusiasts. He could develop these prints without anyone at the society knowing. Then he began cleaning the lower right corner of the canvas. That's where signatures and dates usually appear, the standard location. Artists had been signing work in the lower right for centuries. Half an hour later, he saw the inscription. German script, unmistakable Gothic lettering. A date, 1942. And the artist's signature. K. Schneider, März 1942, Algiers. Kurt Schneider, or perhaps Klaus. Karl, a German name. March 1942, Algiers. Warren sat back. Algiers, French North Africa. Vichy territory until November 1942 when the Allies invaded. Neutral ground where deals were made. Where American businessmen could travel on American passports. Where Axis officials operated openly. Where a German portrait artist might paint American clients who had business with the Reich. Warren photographed the signature, the date, every detail of the emerging lower portrait. Then, he switched off the lamps and left the studio. Outside, it was a bright November day. Cold, clear, deceptively peaceful. People walked past on the sidewalk, going about their ordinary lives. A woman pushed a baby carriage. A postman made his rounds. 2 businessmen stood on the corner discussing the stock market. Normal. Safe. American. Warren walked to a coffee shop 3 blocks away, sat in a booth, and tried to think. The facts were simple. Harlan J. Pritchard, respected industrialist, had been painted in German military uniform in Algiers in March 1942, 3 months after Pearl Harbor. while America was at war with Germany, while American boys were dying in the Pacific and preparing for the fight in Europe, while Pritchard's factories were supposedly producing war materiel for the Allied effort. He'd been in Vichy, North Africa, wearing Wehrmacht dress, having his portrait painted by a German artist. Warren ordered coffee, didn't touch it, stared at the table, tried to find innocent explanations. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe the date was wrong. Maybe it was someone else who looked like Pritchard. Maybe the portrait was a fake, a propaganda piece, something created to discredit him. Maybe. But Warren knew what he'd seen. Knew that conservation work didn't lie. Paint layers told stories. Canvas told the truth. And the truth was that Harlan Pritchard had been painted in German uniform in enemy territory during wartime. That evening, Warren didn't go straight home after work. He stopped by the Society's library and asked for newspaper files from the 1940s. The librarian, an elderly woman with thick-lensed glasses named Miss Patterson, who'd worked at the Society for 30 years, silently brought him several heavy folders bound in green cloth. She gave him a curious look, rare for her. Usually she treated all researchers with the same polite indifference. But tonight she paused. "Research project, Mr. Haskell?" she asked. "Something like that," Warren replied. "For a restoration. Context helps sometimes." She nodded slowly, then returned to her desk. Warren sat at the far table by the window and began leafing through yellowed pages. He was looking for the name Pritchard. Harlan J. Pritchard, president of Pritchard Steel Industries, member of the War Production Board, Distinguished Civilian Service Citation, honorary doctorate from the University of Pennsylvania, respected citizen of Philadelphia. The biography was exemplary. Born in 1898 in Reading, Pennsylvania, to a middle-class family. Father owned a hardware store. Mother was a schoolteacher. Studied engineering at Lehigh University. Graduated 1920. Served briefly in the Army during the First World War. Stationed stateside, never saw combat. Honorable discharge, 1919. Founded a small machine shop in 1921 with money borrowed from his father. Built it into a major steel fabrication company by the late 1930s. During the war, his factories produced tank parts, artillery components, ship fittings. Awarded contracts worth millions. Cited for exceptional contribution to the war effort. After the war, expanded into construction steel, automotive parts. By 1950, Pritchard Steel was one of the largest independent steel companies in the Northeast. Biography impeccable. Typical. Boring. The American dream made flesh. Poor boy, hard work, honest success. Warren turned the pages, reading every line, every date, every phrase. During the war, his factories produced vital war materiel. From 1941 to 1945, in Pennsylvania, safely in the continental United States. Warren closed the folder and looked out the window. Darkness was gathering outside. Evening traffic moved past on Locust Street. If Pritchard ran factories in Pennsylvania from 1941 to 1945, who in March 1942 wore Wehrmacht dress and sat for a German portrait artist in Algiers? Warren opened the next folder. Business section clippings, trade journals, industry magazines. Found an article from Fortune magazine, September 1938. American Steel Goes Global. Featured several industrialists with international operations. Pritchard was mentioned. Had licensing agreements with German steel manufacturers. Perfectly legal. Common practice. Bethlehem Steel had German contracts. U.S. Steel had European partnerships. Before the war, it was just business. Warren found another article. Wall Street Journal, April 1939. Pritchard attending a metallurgy conference in Berlin. Photographed shaking hands with officials from I.G. Farben. The photo showed a younger Pritchard, smiling, relaxed. Behind him, visible in the background, a Nazi banner. Just barely visible, but there. Warren studied the photograph for a long time. He found more. Trade Fair Attendance in Leipzig, 1939. A technical paper co-authored with a Dr. Friedrich Hauser from Krupp Steel on alloy composition, published 1940. Letters to the editor in trade journals about maintaining international scientific cooperation despite political tensions. All perfectly legal. All completely normal for the time. American business had been deeply entangled with German industry throughout the 1930s. Everyone knew that. It was only after Pearl Harbor that these relationships became problematic. After December 7, 1941, they became treasonous. Warren made notes in a small book he'd brought. Names, dates, connections. Then he found something strange. A gap. Late 1941 to mid-1942. 6 months where Pritchard's name disappeared from the newspapers. No articles, no quotes, no society page mentions. Nothing. Then, in July 1942, he reappeared, opening a new factory in Erie, accepting a War Production Board commendation, giving a speech about American industrial might, as if those 6 months hadn't happened. Warren copied the dates carefully. November 1941 to June 1942. 7 months. The German portrait was dated March 1942, right in the middle of the gap. He returned the folders to Miss Patterson. She looked at him over her glasses. "Find what you needed?" she asked. "Some of it," Warren said, "but not all." She smiled faintly. "History is like that," she said, "full of gaps, things people would rather forget." Warren walked home slowly. The November air was cold. He pulled his coat tighter. Philadelphia at night. Safe streets. Electric lights. Cars passing. Democracy. Freedom. Victory. We won the war. We beat the Nazis. We liberated Europe. We were the good guys. The righteous ones. That's what everyone believed. That's what Warren had believed his whole life. But beneath the top layer of paint, something else was hidden. Helen was waiting up when he arrived home. "It's after 10, she said. "I was worried." Warren sat at the kitchen table. Helen put a plate of cold chicken and potato salad in front of him. He ate mechanically, not tasting anything. Helen sat across from him, studying his face. Finally, she said, "This restoration, it's not ordinary, is it?" Warren looked at his wife. They'd been married 11 years. She knew him, knew when he was troubled, knew when he was lying. He made a decision, told her. Everything. The portrait, the Wehrmacht uniform beneath, the German signature, the Algiers notation, the gap in the newspaper record. Helen listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was pale. "What are you going to do?" she asked quietly. Warren shook his head. "I don't know. Document it, I suppose. That's my job. Document what I find." "Then what?" Helen asked. "Then I report to Dr. Ashworth. He decides." Warren could see his wife's mind working. She was smarter than him in many ways. More practical. Better at seeing consequences. "Warren," she said slowly, "Pritchard funds the society. You said so yourself. Ashworth won't want this exposed. It would destroy the society's relationship with a major donor. You could lose your job. We could lose everything." "I know," Warren said, "but what else can I do? Lie? Pretend I didn't see it? Cover it back up?" Helen was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "Maybe that's exactly what you should do." Warren stared at his wife. "What?" "Cover it up," Helen said. "Fix the damage to the top portrait. Restore it beautifully. Document only the surface work. Never mention what's underneath. No one will ever know." Warren felt something cold settle in his chest. "That's lying," he said. "It's survival," Helen countered. "Warren, we have a daughter. We have a mortgage. You have a career. This man, Pritchard, he's powerful, rich, connected. If you expose him, you think he'll just accept it? He'll destroy you. Us. Everything we've built. And for what? Justice? The war's over. We won. What difference does it make what he did during the war? He's not doing it anymore. Warren stood up from the table, walked to the window, looked out at their quiet street. Modest row houses, working families, the American dream in miniature. I became a conservator because I believed in truth, he said quietly, in preserving what's real. Not what people want to see, but what actually is. Professor Eisenstadt taught me that. Truth matters, even when it's inconvenient, especially when it's inconvenient. Helen came to stand beside him, put her hand on his arm. I love that you believe that, she said. But loving truth doesn't pay the mortgage, doesn't keep Margaret in school, doesn't put food on the table. Sometimes survival requires compromise. Warren didn't answer. They stood together in the dark kitchen, both understanding that this decision would define the rest of their lives. The next week, Warren called in sick. He told his supervisor he had the flu, needed a few days to recover. Instead, he took the train to Washington. The reading room of the National Archives was cavernous, echoing, filled with researchers bent over documents. Warren had requested files on American businessmen with German operations before the war. The archivists brought him boxes, dozens of them. There were many. Standard practice in those years. American companies had subsidiaries, partnerships, licensing agreements throughout Europe. Ford had factories in Germany. Henry Ford had received the Grand Cross of the German Eagle in 1938. General Motors owned Opel. IBM sold punch card systems to the Reich. Standard Oil had petroleum agreements. DuPont shared chemical patents. All perfectly legal before December 1941. All carefully severed, officially, once America entered the war. Officially. Warren spent 3 days in the archives, going through corporate records, State Department files, Treasury Department seizure lists. The documents painted a picture he hadn't fully understood. American industry and Nazi Germany had been deeply intertwined throughout the 1930s. Technology transfers, patent licensing, joint ventures. American executives visiting Germany regularly. German engineers visiting America. A web of business relationships that transcended politics. Until the bombs fell on Pearl Harbor. Then, overnight, it all supposedly stopped. Contracts were voided, assets were seized, partnerships dissolved. But Warren found evidence that the severing wasn't always clean. There were hints in the documents, coded language, transactions through neutral intermediaries, Swiss banks, Portuguese holding companies, Argentine subsidiaries, ways to continue business even during wartime. He found Pritchard's name in a 1938 contract with Krupp Steel for licensing of a specialized alloy formulation. Found it again in a 1939 list of American executives who attended the Leipzig Trade Fair. Found it in a 1940 Treasury Department memo noting that Pritchard had closed his German licensing office in Stuttgart but maintained informal technical consultations. The memo was flagged for follow-up. Warren searched for the follow-up. Found nothing. Then the trail went cold. December 1941. All German connections severed. 1942 to 45. Exemplary war production. 1946. Portrait commissioned. Honors received. Reputation spotless. But there was a gap. 6 months. Late 1941 to mid-1942, Warren found a single cryptic note in a State Department file. Query, re H.J. Pritchard travel to Vichy territories, November 1941. No follow-up. No answer. No additional records. Just that one note, typed on onion skin, filed away and forgotten. Warren photographed the document. Photographed everything he found. The contracts, the memos, the trade fair attendance lists, the gaps where records should have been but weren't. He paid for copies of key documents. The archivist, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, processed his requests without comment. People came to the archives looking for all sorts of things: family histories, property disputes, genealogical research. This was just another request. She had no idea what Warren was uncovering. On his last day in Washington, Warren took a chance. Asked the archivist if there were military files available, War Department records from the occupation. She looked at him carefully. "What specifically are you looking for?" "Records of investigations," Warren said, "post-war, into American businesses that collaborated with Germany." The archivist's expression changed subtly. "Those files are restricted," she said. "Some are still classified." "Why?" Warren asked. "The war's been over 5 years." The archivist lowered her voice. "Because they're embarrassing," she said quietly. "Because they show things people would rather forget. That American companies helped build the Nazi war machine. That some of them kept helping even during the war, through cutouts and neutral intermediaries. The government did investigate, extensively, but most of the findings were never made public. Too politically sensitive, too damaging to powerful interests." She looked around the reading room, lowered her voice even more. "Some of the people investigated are still in business, still influential, still making political contributions. The files exist, but they're locked away, sealed for 50 years. Warren felt his stomach sink. "When will they be unsealed?" he asked. 1995, she said, "assuming they're not sealed for longer, assuming they're not quietly destroyed before then." Warren returned to Philadelphia on a Friday evening. His wife Helen met him at the door, worry creasing her face. "You look terrible," she said. "What's wrong?" "Nothing," he lied. "Just the flu. Still recovering." But she could see the truth in his eyes. "You found something," she said. "Something bad." Warren nodded, sat at the kitchen table, told her what he'd discovered. The web of connections, the coded business dealings, the sealed investigation files. Helen listened, her face growing paler. "So you have evidence," she said. "You have proof." "Sort of," Warren said. "I have documents showing business connections before the war. I have gaps in the record during the war. I have a State Department query about Vichy travel. I have a portrait of Pritchard in German uniform painted in Algiers in 1942. But I don't have direct proof of treason. I don't have contracts signed during wartime. I don't have payment records or correspondence, just pieces, circumstantial pieces." Helen was quiet for a long time. Then she asked, "Is it enough?" "Enough for what?" Warren said. "To expose him? To prove he was a collaborator? I don't know. Maybe. Probably not in a court of law. But in the court of public opinion? Maybe. If I can get a newspaper to publish it, if I can get people to care." Helen shook her head. "Warren," she said gently, "nobody wants to hear this. The war's over. We won. We're the good guys. People want to believe that. They don't want to know that American industrialists helped Hitler. They don't want to think about it. They just want to move on, build their lives, raise their families, forget." Warren felt anger rising in his chest. "So we just pretend?" he said. "We just let men like Pritchard be honored as patriots while we know the truth? What about the boys who died fighting the Nazis? Don't they deserve the truth?" Helen's eyes filled with tears. "Of course they do," she said. "But Warren, what will exposing one man accomplish? Will it bring anyone back? Will it change anything? Or will it just destroy you? Us? Our family?" That night, Warren couldn't sleep. He lay in bed next to Helen, staring at the ceiling, thinking. Thinking about truth and lies. About what we choose to remember and what we choose to forget. About the men who died fighting Nazism while other men profited from it. About the photograph he'd seen in the archives, Pritchard shaking hands with IG Farben officials beneath Nazi banners. About the portrait hidden under layers of paint. About his daughter sleeping in the next room, innocent of all this moral complexity. What kind of world was he leaving her? One where truth mattered? Or one where power and money could bury any inconvenient fact? He went to the studio the next morning, Saturday, when the building was nearly empty. Only the weekend security guard who waved him through with barely a glance. Frank, the old veteran, was off weekends. A younger man Warren didn't know well manned the desk. Warren unlocked his workspace and stood before the portrait for a long time before touching it. The man in Wehrmacht dress stared back at him from beneath the American suit. Same person. Two identities. Two lives. One hidden under the other. Warren resumed his work with the scalpel. Slowly, methodically, he cleaned more of the underlying image. By evening, he had revealed most of the original portrait. A German officer, rank insignia showing Hauptmann, captain. Not combat decorations, Warren noted. Administrative insignia. Support services, perhaps. Logistics, supply chain. The kind of officer who would work with foreign businesses on war production. But the uniform was real. The eagle and swastika were real. The date, 1942, was real. And the artist's notation in the margin, which Warren cleaned last, was most revealing of all. Not just the signature and date. There was more. German text. Warren's German was limited, but he could read enough. Quote 4. By commission of the Armistice Commission, the German-Italian Armistice Commission that governed Vichy North Africa until the Allied invasion. Official. Sanctioned. Pritchard hadn't just traveled to Algiers. He'd been there officially, working with Axis authorities, having his portrait painted as part of some formal recognition or delegation. This wasn't innocent business travel. This was collaboration. Active, deliberate collaboration with the enemy during wartime. Warren photographed everything, used all the film he'd brought, set up multiple angles, close-ups of the insignia, wide shots showing the full composition, detail shots of the German text, the signature, the date, everything. Then he did something he'd never done in 15 years of conservation work. He stopped documenting. Put away his camera. Mixed paints matching the original 1946 overpainting. And began to cover his discoveries. Carefully, meticulously, restoring not the truth underneath, but the lie on top. The work took all night. Warren mixed the paints precisely, matched the brushwork of the original overpainting. Layer by layer, he rebuilt the American portrait. The Wehrmacht gray disappeared under American wool. The eagle and swastika vanished beneath the flag pin. The German text was buried under fresh paint. By dawn Sunday, the transformation was complete. The Wehrmacht captain was hidden again. The American industrialist was back. The flag pin gleamed. The face stared out with the same distinguished bearing, as if nothing had ever been different, as if the truth had never existed. Warren cleaned his brushes, packed away his tools, and locked the studio. Walked home through empty Philadelphia streets as church bells began to ring, calling the faithful to worship, calling believers to prayer. Warren felt nothing. No faith, no conviction, just exhaustion and a hollow emptiness in his chest. Helen was making breakfast when he arrived. Pancakes and bacon, Margaret's favorite, Sunday morning ritual. She took one look at Warren's face and said nothing, just poured him coffee and put a plate of eggs before him. Margaret ran in from her bedroom, still in her nightgown, chattering about the comic strip she wanted to read after breakfast. Warren sat at the kitchen table, not eating, not speaking. His daughter's innocent voice washed over him. She was talking about a drawing project at school, about her friend Susan, who could draw horses better than anyone, about wanting to visit an art museum to see real paintings. Finally, Helen sent Margaret to get dressed for church. Once the girl was gone, she asked quietly, "What did you do?" Warren looked at his wife. "Covered it up," he said. "All of it. The Wehrmacht uniform, the insignia, the German text, everything. Painted the American portrait back over it, as if I never saw what was underneath." Helen sat down across from him. "Why?" she asked. Warren put his head in his hands. Because men like Pritchard don't fall, he said. They have lawyers, connections, money, resources I can't imagine. If I go public with what I found, first they'll question my evidence, say the portrait could be anything. A fake, a propaganda piece, misinterpreted. They'll bring in other experts who'll say I'm mistaken. Then they'll question my motives. Why am I trying to destroy a respected businessman? Do I have some grudge? Am I being paid by competitors? They'll investigate my background, find something, anything. Everyone has something. Then they'll destroy my reputation, get me fired, make sure I never work again, blacklist me from every museum and institution. And for what? The truth? Who cares about the truth? He looked up at Helen. The war's over. We won. That's the only truth that matters now. Pritchard built tanks and guns that helped win the war. Whether he also did business with the Nazis before that, during that, it doesn't matter anymore. Everyone did business with Germany in the 30s. Half of American industry had German contracts. After Pearl Harbor, they stopped, or claimed they stopped. But some didn't. Some found ways to continue, through neutral countries, through cutouts, making money from both sides. And after the war, nobody wanted to talk about it. Too embarrassing, too complicated, too many important people involved. So they buried it, sealed the investigation files for 50 years, made sure nobody could prove anything. And the men who collaborated? They went right back to business as usual. Got honored, got praised, got rich, because we needed them. Needed their factories, needed their industrial capacity, needed to rebuild, needed to move on. Helen was silent for a long time. Then she said, "But you'll know. For the rest of your life, you'll know." "Yes," Warren said, "I'll know." "Is it worth it?" she asked. "Knowing the truth but staying silent? To protect our family? Our life?" Warren thought about his daughter in the next room, about the modest apartment they rented, about the small savings account at the bank, about the future he wanted to give Margaret, education, opportunities, security. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I don't know if it's worth it, but it's the choice I made." Helen reached across the table and took his hand. "We'll get through this," she said, "together." Warren nodded, but he knew something had broken inside him. Some fundamental belief in himself, in his integrity, in the possibility of living honestly in a dishonest world. Monday morning, Dr. Ashworth came to check on the restoration progress. "Excellent work," he said, examining the canvas under magnification. "Really first rate. You've stabilized the flaking areas beautifully. Should be ready for reinstallation by summer?" "Yes," Warren said. "By Independence Day, as requested." The director nodded, pleased. "Pritchard will be delighted. He's been very concerned about the portrait, very particular about its care. He's planning to be present for the reinstallation ceremony. Wants to make a speech about preserving Pennsylvania's industrial heritage." "I'm sure he does," Warren said quietly. Ashworth looked at him sharply. "Is something wrong?" "No," Warren said. "Just tired. Been working long hours to get this done properly." Ashworth clapped him on the shoulder. "That's the dedication we value, Warren. The society is lucky to have you." After Ashworth left, Warren sat alone in the studio. He'd made his choice, chosen safety over truth, security over honor, survival over integrity. He told himself it was practical, realistic, the smart decision, the decision that protected his family, the decision that let him keep his job and his livelihood and his quiet middle-class life. But that night, he stopped at a bar on his way home. Flynn's Tavern, a working-class place 3 blocks from the apartment. Dark wood, brass fixtures, smell of beer and cigarette smoke. Just one drink, he told himself, to steady his nerves, to quiet the voice in his head that kept whispering, "Coward." It wasn't one drink. It became 3. Then 5. The bartender, a thick-necked Irishman named Paddy, looked at him with concern. "You okay there, Mr. Haskell?" Warren nodded. "Fine. Just a long day." He stumbled home after midnight. Helen helped him to bed, her face tight with worry but saying nothing. This became the pattern. Every night, stopping at Flynn's. Every morning, arriving at work with hands that shook slightly. Every day, looking at that portrait and knowing what lay beneath. Knowing that his skill, his craft, his training as a conservator had been used not to reveal truth, but to conceal it. That he'd become an accomplice to lies. That every time someone looked at that portrait and saw a patriotic American industrialist, they were seeing his work, his betrayal of everything he'd been taught to value. The drinking helped him not think about it, helped him sleep without dreaming, helped him face Helen's disappointed eyes across the breakfast table, helped him function. The restoration was completed in May 1951. The portrait was reinstalled in the State House with a small ceremony. Governor John Fine attended. Pritchard gave brief remarks thanking the Historical Society for their care of Pennsylvania's artistic heritage. Photographers took pictures. The Philadelphia Inquirer ran a short article with a photo of Pritchard standing beside his restored portrait, smiling. "The Society's conservation work preserves our Commonwealth's cultural legacy for future generations," Pritchard said in the quote. "We owe a debt to skilled craftsmen like those at the Pennsylvania Historical Society who ensure these treasures endure." Warren stood in the back of the crowd, wearing his only good suit, and watched. Watched Harlan Pritchard shake hands and smile and accept congratulations. Watched the man who'd worn a Wehrmacht uniform in Vichy, North Africa, being honored as a patriotic American industrialist. Watched politicians and businessmen and society figures applaud. Watched the lie become official history, permanent, unchangeable, set in stone and paint and bronze plaques. Nobody knew. Nobody would ever know. Except Warren. And the knowledge was eating him alive from the inside. After the ceremony, there was a reception, champagne and canapes in the State House's formal dining room. Warren attended because Ashworth expected him to. Stood in a corner with a glass of champagne he didn't drink, watching the celebration. Pritchard worked the room like the politician he essentially was, shaking hands, telling stories, laughing. At one point, he approached Warren. "You're the conservator, aren't you?" Pritchard said, extending his hand. "Mr. Haskell, yes?" Warren shook the offered hand, felt the firm grip. Looked into the face he'd studied so intimately for 6 months. "Yes, sir," Warren said. "Excellent work," Pritchard said. "The portrait looks magnificent. Better than new." "Thank you," Warren said quietly. Pritchard smiled, leaned in slightly. "I understand conservation work requires discretion," he said. "That you sometimes discover things during restoration, things that might be surprising. But a good conservator knows what's important to preserve and what's better left alone. Don't you agree?" Warren felt ice in his stomach. Understood that he was being tested, being warned. "Yes, sir," he said. "I understand completely." "Good man," Pritchard said, and moved away to greet the governor. Warren left the reception early, went directly to Flynn's, drank until Patty cut him off. The bartender called Helen to come get him. She arrived with angry tears in her eyes, helped him into a taxi, got him home and into bed. Then she sat on the edge of their bed and said, "I can't do this anymore, Warren. Can't watch you destroy yourself. You have to stop drinking. You have to get past whatever's eating you. For Margaret's sake, if not for mine." Warren looked at his wife through alcohol-blurred vision. "I covered up a crime," he said. "I helped a Nazi collaborator hide his past. And now he knows I know. And I'm going to have to live with that for the rest of my life. And I don't know how to do it sober." Helen started to cry. Truly cry. Great, racking sobs. "We should leave Philadelphia," she said. "Start over somewhere else. Somewhere you won't have to see that portrait. Somewhere you can forget." Warren laughed bitterly. "There is no forgetting," he said, "because I'll always know what I did, what I chose, and no amount of distance will change that." The drinking got worse. Helen tried everything: pleading, anger, ultimatums, support, silence. Nothing worked. Warren couldn't explain to her what he couldn't explain to himself: the weight of the secret, the knowledge that he'd chosen comfort over conscience, that he'd become complicit in the same lie he'd uncovered, that he'd betrayed Professor Eisenstadt's teaching, betrayed his craft, betrayed himself. By 1953, he was drinking before work. Not drunk, but enough to steady his hands, enough to face the day. The other conservators noticed. Colleagues he'd worked with for years. They said nothing directly, but Warren could see it in their eyes. The concern, the disappointment, the slow distancing. In 1954, he was let go from the Historical Society. Performance issues, they said. Unreliability, missed deadlines, work quality declining. Dr. Ashworth was regretful but firm. "I'm sorry, Warren," he said, sitting across the desk in his office. "You were one of our best, but we can't have this. The Society's reputation depends on excellence. You understand." Warren understood. Gathered his personal tools from his studio. 15 years of work. Gone. He walked out of the building for the last time on a gray afternoon in March. Didn't look back. He found occasional work, small private commissions, cleaning paintings for estate sales, touch-up work for antique dealers. Enough to keep from complete destitution. Not enough to stop drinking. Helen left in 1956, took their daughter Margaret, now 13, and moved back to her parents' house in Wilmington. "I can't watch you destroy yourself anymore," she said while packing their things. "Maybe if you'd told me the truth, the whole truth, not just about the portrait, but about what it means to you, why you can't let it go. But you just drink and say nothing, and I can't live with a ghost. I can't raise my daughter in this. Margaret needs stability, needs a future, and you can't give her that anymore." Warren sat at the kitchen table and watched his wife pack their lives into boxes. Watched his daughter cry and ask why they had to leave. Tried to explain and couldn't find words. Helen filed for divorce. It was finalized in 1957. Warren moved to a boarding house in South Philadelphia. A single room on the 3rd floor. Narrow bed, bureau, hot plate, shared bathroom down the hall, window overlooking an alley. He worked when he could find work, drank when he couldn't. Sometimes both. Time became a blur of bottles and empty days, lost years. Occasionally, he'd read in the newspaper about Pritchard. The business kept expanding. New plants in Ohio, in West Virginia, thousands of workers, millions in revenue. Pritchard became a philanthropist, donated to hospitals, funded scholarships at Lehigh University, built a wing at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, praised as a model of American enterprise, a self-made man who gave back. The newspapers loved him. Society pages showed him at gallows, at charity events, surrounded by senators and governors and presidents of universities. And the portrait still hung in the State House. Warren knew because sometimes, drunk and maudlin, he'd take the bus to Harrisburg, stand in the Hall of Industry staring up at that face, the face he'd helped preserve, the lie he'd helped perpetuate. Security guards would eventually ask him to move along. "Sir, are you all right? Do you need assistance?" And Warren would leave, take the bus back to Philadelphia, back to his rented room, back to the bottle. In 1962, President Kennedy gave a speech about the new generation of American leadership, about men who built this nation's industrial might, who won the war, who now guided us into the space age. Pritchard was mentioned as an example, a man who'd contributed so much to America's strength, a titan of industry who embodied the entrepreneurial spirit that made America great. Warren read the speech in the Philadelphia Inquirer while sitting in his boarding house room. Laughed bitterly. poured himself another drink from the bottle of cheap whiskey he'd bought with money from cleaning a painting for an estate lawyer. The painting had been a fake. He'd known immediately. The brushwork was wrong, the craquelure patterns artificially induced. He'd said nothing, just cleaned it, took the $20, bought whiskey. Truth didn't pay. Lies did. In 1968, during the violence and protests of that terrible year, Warren had a moment of clarity. Maybe now, he thought. Maybe with everything being questioned, everything being challenged, authority being overthrown, young people demanding truth, maybe now someone would listen. Martin Luther King had been murdered. Robert Kennedy had been murdered. Cities were burning. Students were rioting. The establishment was being torn down. Maybe this was the moment. He still had the photographs, had kept them all these years, hidden in a locked metal box under his bed. Insurance against forgetting, against letting himself pretend it never happened. He got them out, looked at them with shaking hands. The Wehrmacht portrait, the Algiers notation, the German text, the proof. 26 photographs, the entire uncovering sequence, plus the documents he'd copied from the National Archives, the contracts, the trade fair attendance, the State Department query, the gap in the public record. He took them to the Philadelphia Inquirer, asked to speak with an investigative reporter. The receptionist looked at him with barely concealed distaste, an old drunk in a threadbare coat carrying a battered briefcase. She almost turned him away. But something in his eyes, some desperate intensity, made her pause. She made a call, sent him up to the newsroom, to a young man named Callahan, probably not yet 30, with long sideburns and skeptical eyes, who'd made a name covering anti-war protests and police brutality. Callahan listened because that's what young crusading reporters did in 1968. Listened to anyone who claimed to have a story about corruption, about lies, about the rottenness of the system. Warren laid out the photographs across Callahan's cluttered desk, told the whole story. The portrait, the Wehrmacht uniform, the Algiers Commission, the investigation files sealed for 50 years, the business connections, the gaps in the record. Callahan listened, took notes in a spiral reporter's notebook, studied the photographs carefully, asked good questions. Who else knows about this? Just you? And your wife? Ex-wife? Anyone at the Historical Society? Warren answered honestly. No one else knew. He'd worked alone, documented alone, made his decision alone. Callahan said he'd look into it, said it could be important, said things like this needed to come out. The old generation's lies needed to be exposed. Give me 2 weeks, Callahan said. 2 weeks later, Callahan called Warren to the newspaper office, sat him down in a small conference room, explained gently that he'd done due diligence, contacted sources at State Department, Defense Department, Treasury. All the wartime records had been reviewed as part of standard post-war auditing. Pritchard had been investigated. Twice. Once in 1944 by the War Department, once in 1946 by the State Department. Both times cleared. Any business dealings with German firms before Pearl Harbor were legal at the time. Any travel to neutral territories was permissible for American citizens. The Army had investigated all major defense contractors in 1945 to 46 as part of standard denazification protocols applied to American businesses with European connections. Pritchard Steel had received full clearance. Moreover, Callahan said, even if we could prove Pritchard was in Algiers in 1942, so what? America wasn't at war with Vichy France. Technically, the Armistice Commission governed French territories that were officially neutral. American businessmen could travel there on American passports. There's no law against it. No treason. But he was wearing a German uniform, Warren said, having his portrait painted by a German artist. For the Armistice Commission. That's collaboration. Callahan shook his head. Could be anything. Ceremonial. Political theater. The Vichy government was officially neutral. They worked with both Axis and Allies. An American businessman operating there might have worn various uniforms for formal occasions. It's weird, sure. Suspicious, maybe. But it's not proof of actual collaboration. Not proof he was selling war material to Germany. Not proof of espionage or treason. And the portrait itself? Warren asked desperately. The evidence? Callahan looked at him with genuine sympathy. Mr. Haskell, you said yourself you painted over it. So there's no physical evidence now anyway. Just your word and these photographs that could theoretically be faked or misinterpreted. You'd need the actual portrait. You'd need to uncover it again. Publicly. With witnesses. And even then, Pritchard's lawyers would argue it proves nothing illegal. I worked at the Historical Society for 15 years, Warren said. I was one of their best conservators. I know what I saw. I know what I documented. This is real. I believe you, Callahan said quietly. But belief isn't proof. And even if I could write this story, even if my editor would run it, Pritchard would sue. He'd sue you. He'd sue the paper. He'd tie us up in court for years. And he'd probably win because you don't have conclusive evidence of actual criminal activity, just suspicious circumstances. I'm sorry, Mr. Haskell, but there's no story here. Not one I can publish. Warren left the newspaper building and walked to the nearest bar, drank until they threw him out at closing time, stumbled through city streets, ended up somehow at the art museum, sat on the steps where Rocky would run a few years later, watched the dawn come up over Philadelphia. The photographs went back in the box under the bed. He never showed them to anyone again. In 1973, Harlan Pritchard died. Heart attack at his estate in Bryn Mawr, age 75. The obituaries ran for days. Tributes poured in from business leaders, politicians, philanthropists. A self-made man, a titan of industry, a patriot who helped win the war and then built the peace. His funeral was attended by senators, congressmen, corporate CEOs. The governor gave a eulogy. The portrait from the State House was displayed at the service, draped in black crepe and American flags. Warren read about it in the newspaper someone had left on a bench in Rittenhouse Square. Felt nothing. Just emptiness. That same year, Warren was diagnosed with cirrhosis, advanced stage. The doctor at the free clinic told him he had maybe a year, 18 months if he stopped drinking immediately. Warren nodded, didn't stop. What would be the point? He had nothing left to preserve. The doctor gave him pamphlets about Alcoholics Anonymous, about liver disease, about choosing life. Warren took them politely, threw them away in the first trash can he passed. He moved into a veterans' home in Chester. Medicaid paid for a shared room with 3 other dying men. One had emphysema from years in the coal mines. One had terminal cancer. One had advanced dementia and thought he was still fighting in the Pacific. Warren lay in his narrow bed and thought about the choices he'd made, about who he'd been. A talented artist, a skilled conservator, an honest man who believed truth mattered, about who he'd become. A drunk, an accomplice, a gravedigger of truth who'd chosen survival over integrity and found that survival without integrity wasn't worth having. Had it been the right choice back in 1950? Had he protected his family by staying silent? Helen had left anyway. Margaret had grown up without him. He'd lost everything he tried to save. Would speaking out have been worse? Would they have been destroyed more completely? Or would standing for truth, even losing everything for truth, have left him with something more valuable than this slow death in a charity ward? He didn't know. Never knew for certain. That was the worst part. Not the drinking, not the lost career, not the poverty. The uncertainty. The eternal question with no answer. What if? Margaret came to visit in March 1974. His daughter, now 31, with a family of her own, a husband, a baby son. She'd tracked him down through the Veterans Administration, hadn't seen him in 7 years. She sat by his bedside, held his yellow, liver-spotted hand. "I'm sorry I wasn't a better father," Warren said. His voice was weak. "I'm sorry I let the drinking take over. I'm sorry I wasn't there for you." She cried quietly. "I never understood why," she said. "Mother said you were brilliant once, talented, that you loved your work. What happened? What broke you?" Warren closed his eyes. Couldn't tell her. Couldn't explain. The story was too long, too complicated, too shameful. Just whispered, "I made a choice. Wrong choice. But I thought it was right at the time. Thought I was protecting you, protecting us. But I was just protecting myself. From consequences. And the consequence of avoiding consequences is this life, this death. I'm sorry." She stayed until visiting hours ended, kissed his forehead, said she forgave him even though she didn't understand, said goodbye. Warren died 3 days later, March 23, 1974, exactly 23 years and 4 months after he first laid eyes on Harlan Pritchard's portrait. The nursing staff found him in the morning. Peaceful. They said it was peaceful. A nurse who'd been kind to him in his last weeks mentioned that he'd been whispering in his sleep the night before. Something about paint, about truth, about layers. She didn't understand. Nobody did. The funeral was small. A handful of people from the veterans' home, Margaret and her husband Peter, a young lawyer, a chaplain who read a brief service at a funeral home that smelled of flowers and formaldehyde. They buried him in a public cemetery outside Philadelphia. A simple headstone. Warren Haskell, 1914 to 1974. Margaret was the last to leave. She stood by the grave thinking about the father she'd barely known, the brilliant man who'd become a drunk. What had broken him? What secret had made him give up on everything? The answer went into the ground with him. A month later, cleaning out his room at the veterans' home, Margaret found the locked metal box under the bed. The key was taped to the bottom. Inside were photographs. Old photographs on yellowing paper, carefully preserved in glassine envelopes. A man in German military uniform. A portrait, photographed in stages of being uncovered. Documentation of restoration work, she realized. Her father's work. Professional. Meticulous. And documents. Photocopied pages from archives. Letters, notes, newspaper clippings about someone named Harlan J. Pritchard. Trade contracts. State Department memos. A carefully compiled dossier. Margaret didn't understand. Why had her father kept these? What did they mean? She took the box home, showed her husband Peter. They spent an evening going through everything together, tried to piece it together. Peter was a lawyer, recently graduated from Temple University Law School. He understood what they were looking at. Evidence of collaboration, he said. Or at least evidence that this Pritchard guy had some connection to the Germans during the war. These photographs show a portrait of Pritchard in Wehrmacht uniform. Your father documented finding it underneath a modern portrait, dated 1942, painted in Algiers. But it's all circumstantial. No direct proof of wrongdoing. No smoking gun. And the man's been dead a year. What would be the point of pursuing it now? Margaret held one of the photographs, the portrait her father had documented, the hidden truth he'd uncovered, and covered back up. Why didn't he tell anyone, she asked. Peter thought for a moment. Maybe he tried. Maybe nobody would listen. Or maybe he was scared. Pritchard was powerful, rich, connected. Your father was just a conservator, working class, no resources. Going up against someone like that, you could lose everything. Maybe he did lose everything, Margaret said quietly. Maybe that's why he drank himself to death. Maybe he couldn't live with what he knew. Couldn't live with staying silent. But couldn't figure out how to speak out either. They sat in their living room, the box of documents between them. Their baby son asleep upstairs. Their modest house in the suburbs. Their normal life. Peter finally said, "What do you want to do with this? Expose it?" Pritchard's been dead a year. His company's still running, but it's been sold to a conglomerate. His family's still prominent in Philadelphia society. His widow's alive. His children, grandchildren. You could cause them embarrassment, maybe some damage to their reputation. But you can't undo history, can't prosecute a dead man, can't change what happened. And you'd have to prove your father's documentation is authentic, prove he wasn't mistaken or lying. That's an uphill battle. Margaret looked at the photographs for a long time, thought about her father, about the secret that had destroyed him, about whether revealing it now would honor his sacrifice or just be pointless revenge, about whether the truth mattered more than the pain it would cause. She made her decision. She put everything back in the box, put the box in the attic of their house in a corner behind old Christmas decorations and baby clothes Margaret had saved. Maybe someday, she told Peter, when enough time has passed, when everyone involved is long dead, when it's just history, not personal, maybe then someone should know. But not now. Not yet. Peter nodded, understood. They never spoke of it again. The years passed. Margaret's children grew up, Eric and Jennifer. She never told them about the box in the attic, about their grandfather's secret. They knew him only as a vague, tragic figure, the grandfather who died before they were born, who'd had problems with alcohol, who'd been estranged from the family. A cautionary tale more than a real person. The box stayed in the attic. Through the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, collecting dust, waiting. Margaret sometimes thought about it. When she read about corporate scandals, about powerful men whose crimes were eventually exposed, about historical reckonings with uncomfortable truths, she'd think about going up to the attic, getting the box, finally doing something. But she never did. The moment always passed. Life moved forward. The past stayed buried. The portrait of Harlan J. Pritchard still hangs in the Pennsylvania State House, Hall of Industry, second floor, east wall, beautifully restored. Academic execution, confident bearing, patriotic symbolism, an exemplary American industrialist who helped win the war. Visitors pass by occasionally, glance at the nameplate. School groups on field trips, tourists visiting the capital. Most don't stop. Those who do see an unremarkable portrait of an unremarkable businessman from a bygone era. The placard beneath identifies him. Harlan J. Pritchard, 1898 to 1973. President, Pritchard Steel Industries. Member, War Production Board. Distinguished Service Citation for Industrial Contribution to Allied Victory, 1946. Nobody knows what lies beneath the top layer of paint. The Wehrmacht captain. March 1942. Algiers Commission. The Hoheitsabzeichen. The truth painted over with American lies. A crime hidden behind artistic competence. Deception become official history. The restorer who knew the truth and stayed silent died in poverty and obscurity. The man whose secret he kept lived a long, successful life and died in his bed, surrounded by family, mourned as a distinguished citizen of the Commonwealth. His funeral was attended by dignitaries. His name is engraved on bronze plaques in multiple locations. His foundation still awards scholarships. His portrait hangs in the hall, beneath the top layer of paint. Forever.